The European Union-India Free Trade Agreement did not emerge from economic inevitability. It emerged from strategic anxiety. After nearly 2 decades of stalled negotiations, the sudden convergence between Brussels and New Delhi reflects not a breakthrough in trade technicalities, but a reassessment of power, vulnerability, and position in a rapidly fragmenting global order. For much of the post-Cold War era, globalization was assumed to be a neutral and irreversible process. Trade liberalization, supply chain integration, and regulatory convergence were treated as technocratic exercises insulated from geopolitics. That assumption no longer holds. Over the past decade, trade has increasingly been repurposed as an instrument of state power. Tariffs, sanctions, export controls, and market access restrictions have become tools not merely of economic management, but of strategic coercion. This shift marks the return of what can be described as hegemonic policy, the use of structural economic dominance to shape the behavior of other states without direct military force. In practice, this has meant leveraging control over markets, currencies, technology, and supply chains to reward alignment and punish deviation. The United States and China, as the world's 2 largest economies, have been the primary practitioners of this approach, albeit in different forms and with different ideological justifications. For the European Union, this reality has been deeply unsettling. Europe's economic model depends on openness, predictability, and multilateral rules. Yet in recent years, the EU has found itself exposed on multiple fronts. Transatlantic trade disputes demonstrated the limits of alliance-based economic security. Dependence on Chinese manufacturing revealed vulnerabilities in critical supply chains, and the weaponization of energy and trade following Russia. This invasion of Ukraine underscored how economic interdependence can be transformed into strategic liability. These experiences forced a recalibration in European thinking. The concept of strategic autonomy, once dismissed as aspirational rhetoric, became a guiding framework. This did not imply withdrawal from global markets, but diversification of dependencies and the construction of alternative partnerships. Within this context, India emerged not as a replacement for existing relationships, but as a strategic complement large enough to matter, yet sufficiently independent to avoid direct subordination to any single power bloc. India's position in the global system has also evolved. Historically committed to non-alignment, New Delhi has increasingly adopted a posture of selective engagement. India seeks access to markets, capital, and technology while resisting formal alliances that would constrain its strategic flexibility. Its growing population, expanding industrial base, and centrality to Indo-Pacific trade routes have enhanced its leverage, but also increased external pressure. This pressure has been particularly visible in the trade domain. Tariff escalations, regulatory barriers, and geopolitical conditionality imposed by major powers have complicated India's export ambitions. Sectors such as textiles, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing, key sources of employment, have been exposed to abrupt policy shifts beyond New Delhi's control. As a result, diversifying export destinations and embedding Indian firms within alternative trade architectures has become a strategic priority rather than an economic preference. The resumption of EU-India negotiations in the early 2020s must be understood against this backdrop. Talks initially launched in 2007 collapsed in the early 2010s due to disagreements over market access, regulatory standards, and intellectual property. At the time, the strategic costs of failure were low. Globalization was still expanding. China was deeply integrated into global trade, and the United States remained committed, at least rhetorically, to multilateralism. That environment has since disappeared. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 accelerated Europe's recognition that the international system was entering a phase of sustained instability. Simultaneously intensifying US-China rivalry demonstrated how quickly trade could be transformed into a battlefield for both the EU and India. The conclusion was similar. Reliance on a narrow set of economic partners increased strategic exposure. This convergence of threat perception created what policymakers have described as geopolitical momentum. It was not enthusiasm that drove negotiations forward, but urgency. The EU needed partners that could absorb trade, share supply chain risk, and support a rules-based framework without demanding political subordination. India needed access to large markets that did not condition trade on alignment within great power rivalry. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Does this agreement represent a genuine challenge to hegemonic policy, or is it merely an adaptive response that operates within its constraints? Is the EU-India deal an early signal of a more distributed global order, or a defensive maneuver by middle powers seeking shelter from intensifying pressure? Part I establishes the strategic context in which this agreement was born. The answer to that question depends not on declarations or symbolism, but on the mechanics of the deal itself, how power is allocated, how dependencies are managed, and whether this partnership alters the balance of leverage in global trade. The mechanics of power. What the EU-India deal actually. 2. Assess whether the EU-India agreement constitutes a challenge to hegemonic policy. It is necessary to move beyond political rhetoric and examine the structure of the deal itself. Trade agreements do not redistribute power by intention alone. They do so through rules, standards, market access, and enforcement mechanisms. It is within these technical details that strategic consequences are embedded. At its core, the EU-India agreement is expansive in scope. It seeks to integrate two large and structurally different economies by reducing tariffs, aligning regulatory frameworks, and facilitating investment across goods and services. The scale is significant. Together, the EU and India represent a combined market approaching 2 billion people. However, size alone does not determine strategic impact. The decisive question is how this integration alters patterns of dependence and leverage. For India, the most immediate gains are concentrated in export-oriented sectors. Textiles, garments, pharmaceuticals, and selected manufacturing industries stand to benefit from improved access to European markets. These sectors are not only economically important, they are politically sensitive due to their role in employment generation. By expanding market access beyond the United States and China, the agreement offers Indian exporters a degree of insulation from abrupt tariff shifts and politically motivated trade restrictions. From a strategic perspective, this diversification matters. Dependence on a limited number of large markets amplifies vulnerability to coercive economic measures. By embedding Indian production more deeply into European supply chains, the agreement reduces the marginal leverage any single external power can exert. This does not eliminate exposure, but it complicates the use of trade as a unilateral pressure tool. For the European Union, the agreement serves a different but complementary function. Europe gains access to a large and growing consumer market, as well as opportunities to reposition supply chains that have become overly concentrated in East Asia. In policy terms, India is increasingly viewed as a trusted partner rather than a low-cost alternative. The distinction is important. The EU is not simply seeking cheaper production, but greater resilience through diversification. Supply chains occupy a central place in this calculation. Over the past decade, they have evolved from efficiency-driven systems into strategic assets. Concentration in a single geography maximizes short-term efficiency, but creates long-term risk. The EU-India agreement reflects an attempt to rebalance this equation by spreading production, sourcing, and assembly across multiple jurisdictions. India's role is not to replace China wholesale, but to reduce systemic overdependence. However, the limits of this shift must be acknowledged. Infrastructure constraints, regulatory complexity, and skills mismatches mean that India cannot rapidly absorb large-scale industrial relocation. The agreement therefore represents an incremental adjustment rather than a structural break. This gradualism reduces disruption, but also tempers expectations about transformative impact. Beyond economics, the agreement functions as strategic signaling. Trade agreements communicate political intent without the formal obligations of military alliances. In this case, the signal is directed outward as much as inward. To Washington, the deal suggests that Europe is willing to pursue autonomous economic partnerships even as transatlantic relations persist. To Beijing, it indicates that alternatives to China-centric trade architecture are being actively developed. Yet signaling does not automatically translate into autonomy. One of the most consequential dimensions of the agreement lies in regulatory standards. The European Union is a global standard setter. Its regulatory frameworks often become de facto global norms because access to the European market requires compliance. In this sense, integration with the EU can deepen asymmetries. even as it expands opportunity. For India, regulatory alignment presents a dual-edged outcome. On one hand, it facilitates market access and enhances credibility. On the other, it may constrain domestic policy flexibility over time. The export of European standards can function as a subtle form of influence, shaping industrial practices and governance without explicit coercion. Whether this constitutes benign coordination or structural leverage depends on implementation and enforcement. This raises a broader question about power distribution within the agreement. While presented as a partnership of equals, the EU and India enter negotiations with different forms of leverage. The EU's strength lies in regulatory coherence and market access. India's strength lies in scale, growth potential, and strategic geography. The balance between these assets will determine whether the agreement reinforces or mitigates existing hierarchies. Crucially, the agreement tests India's long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy. Greater economic integration inevitably produces expectations of policy coordination. While the deal does not bind India to European geopolitical positions, deeper trade ties may generate indirect pressures in areas such as sanctions, compliance, technology governance, and supply chain security. From the perspective of hegemonic policy, the agreement neither dismantles nor fully escapes existing power structures. Instead, it alters the cost-benefit calculus of coercion. By increasing the number of economically significant relationships, it reduces the effectiveness of unilateral pressure. At the same time, it introduces new forms of interdependence that carry their own constraints. Thus, the EU-India agreement should be understood as a defensive adaptation, rather than a direct challenge. It does not seek to overturn hegemonic systems, but to navigate within them more safely. Whether this navigation accumulates into meaningful systemic change depends on how such agreements interact, multiply, and evolve. That broader question whether the EU-India deal is an isolated adjustment or part of a wider reconfiguration of global power acquires a systemic perspective. The strategic significance of the EU-India agreement ultimately lies not in its bilateral provisions, but in what it reveals about the evolving structure of the international system. Trade agreements, when viewed in isolation, offer limited insight into power shifts. When examined collectively, however, they can signal deeper transformations in how states manage dependence, risk, and influence in an era no longer defined by stable hegemony. The contemporary global order is increasingly shaped by what might be described as networked power, rather than hierarchical control. Instead of rigid blocks aligned under a single dominant actor, states are constructing overlapping partnerships across trade, technology, and security domains. These arrangements are not alliances in the traditional sense. They're flexible, issue-specific, and often deliberately ambiguous. The EU-India deal fits squarely within this pattern. In this context, the agreement functions as an additional anchor in a system under strain. As rivalry between major powers intensifies, the costs of over-reliance on any single economic center have risen. For both the European Union and India, diversification is not an abstract preference, but a stabilizing strategy. By broadening their economic networks, they reduce exposure to sudden policy shifts emanating from Washington or Beijing. This approach highlights the growing role of middle and major non-hegemonic powers in shaping the global environment. Neither the EU nor India seeks to replace existing hegemons. Instead, they aim to increase strategic density, creating multiple points of economic connection that make coercion more difficult and fragmentation more manageable. In such a system, influence is diffused rather than concentrated, even if ultimate power remains uneven. However, it would be premature to interpret this as a decisive move toward a post-hegemonic order. The key pillars of global power remain highly centralized. Financial systems continue to be anchored in a limited number of currencies and institutions. Advanced technologies are controlled through narrow choke points. Security guarantees, particularly in times of crisis, are still provided by a small group of states. Trade agreements alone cannot dislodge these structures. The EU-India deal therefore operates within clear constraints, adjusts the margins of autonomy without redefining the core architecture. This distinction is critical. Structural change requires cumulative effects, multiple agreements, aligned incentives, and sustained political commitment over time. A single partnership, no matter how large, can only signal intent, not deliver transformation. Comparative perspective reinforces this conclusion. Similar dynamics are visible in other regional and bilateral arrangements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many of these agreements emphasize diversification, resilience, and selective alignment. Few explicitly challenge dominant powers. Instead, they seek room for maneuver within an increasingly contested system. The EU-India agreement is notable not because it breaks this pattern, but because it exemplifies it at scale. For the global South, the implications are mixed. On one hand, the agreement demonstrates that large markets can negotiate partnerships without formal subordination to great power rivalry. This offers a potential model for countries seeking economic integration without political entanglement. On the other hand, asymmetries in regulatory capacity and bargaining power persist. Replication without adaptation could entrench new dependencies rather than alleviate old ones. Looking ahead, several trajectories are plausible. The agreement could deepen, extending cooperation into technology, energy, and industrial policy, thereby strengthening mutual resilience. Alternatively, it could remain largely transactional, constrained by domestic politics and external pressure. A third possibility is dilution, as shifting geopolitical priorities redirect attention elsewhere. Each scenario depends not only on EU-India relations, but on how major powers respond. Great powers are unlikely to view such agreements with indifference. Some may accommodate diversification as a stabilizing force. Others may seek to counter it through incentives or pressure. The effectiveness of hegemonic policy in the coming decade will hinge on whether it adapts to a more networked world or attempts to reassert centralized control at increasing cost. In this light, the EU-India agreement should be understood less as a challenge to hegemony and more as a symptom of its limits. It reflects a growing recognition that unilateral dominance is harder to sustain, and that resilience now depends on plural connections rather than singular alignment. Geopolitical momentum, in this case, is not the momentum of ascent, but of adjustment. The central conclusion is therefore cautious. The EU-India deal does not overturn hegemonic policy, nor does it inaugurate a new global order. It contributes to a gradual rebalancing in which power is exercised through networks rather than commands, and autonomy is pursued through diversification rather than defiance. Whether this evolution leads to greater stability or deeper fragmentation remains an open question, one that will be answered not by declarations but by accumulation over time. As this analysis concludes, thank you for staying with us through a complex and evolving geopolitical story. In a world where power is increasingly exercised quietly through trade, regulation, and economic pressure, careful attention matters more than ever. If this kind of calm, serious analysis helps you think more clearly about global affairs, consider subscribing to the channel. Not as a routine click, but as a way of supporting thoughtful, long-form geopolitical discussion. And before you go, do let us know, from which country and which part of the world are you watching this conversation unfold?